The sun hung low over the barbed wire fences of Camp Shelby, casting long shadows across the dusty parade ground. Sergeant Karl Becker wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, the Mississippi heat clinging to his uniform like a second skin. He was 32, broad-shouldered from years on the family farm in Bavaria, and now reduced to this: a prisoner of war, herded like cattle among thousands of his fellow Germans captured after the Normandy push. The Americans had shipped them south, away from the front lines, to this sprawling base in the piney woods. Karl's group, 200 or so from the 12th Infantry Division, had arrived 2 weeks back, their boots still caked with French mud. Beside him, Private Hans Muller hunched over a tin cup of lukewarm coffee substitute, his wiry frame swallowed by the oversized fatigues the Yanks had issued. Hans was the joker of their small barrack crew, 24 and sharp-tongued, with a scar across his cheek from a shrapnel kiss in the Ardennes. He slurped noisily, then grimaced. "Tastes like boiled socks. If this is victory, I'd rather lose again." Karl shot him a warning glance. Across the compound, Corporal Fritz Lang leaned against a wooden post, his lean face etched with the quiet caution that had kept him alive through 3 years of foxholes. Fritz was the thinker, 30, with a mechanic's hands and a habit of fiddling with whatever scrap he could find. He didn't laugh at Hans's quips. Instead, he scanned the horizon, where American guards patrolled with rifles slung easy over their shoulders. "Keep it down," Fritz murmured. "The MPs don't need an excuse today." The 3 of them formed the core of Barrack 14, a tight knot forged in the chaos of surrender. Karl, the steady leader by default. Hans, the spark that kept spirits from flatlining. Fritz, the one who patched wounds and worries alike. Their 4th, young Private Otto Klein, was off in the latrines, battling the dysentery that swept the camp like a rumor. No grand alliances here, just survival, one roll call at a time. Reveille had barely faded when the camp commandant, a lanky major named Harlan with a drawl thick as sorghum, strode into view flanked by 2 privates. He stopped at the center of the yard, megaphone in hand, and cleared his throat. The POWs assembled in ragged lines, murmuring in low German. Harlan's voice boomed out, translated haltingly by a bilingual sergeant. "Men, you've been idle too long. Uncle Sam ain't running a resort. Starting tomorrow, work details, roads, barracks maintenance, and for you lot in the vegetable crews, gardens. Real ones. Plant what you know." A ripple of confusion spread through the ranks. Gardens. Karl exchanged looks with Fritz. In the fatherland, POW camps were stone and starvation. Here, the Americans talked of dirt and seeds like it was a favor. Hans snorted softly. "They want us to play farmer? Fine, as long as it's not potatoes again." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the barracks, the 4 reunited in their corner of the long wooden hut. Otto had rallied, pale but grinning, his boyish face, barely 19, framed by tousled blonde hair. He sprawled on his bunk, clutching a dog-eared letter from home. "Mutti says the cows are fat this year. If they let us near real soil, maybe we send her some American tomatoes." Fritz unpacked a small kit from under his bunk, wire cutters, a bent spoon, bits of cloth. "First, we see what they mean by lettuce. Could be a trap, minefields disguised as flower beds." His voice was even, but his fingers tightened on the spoon. Karl sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the plank floor. He'd been a sergeant once, leading men through hedgerows and hellfire. Now, orders came from boys half his age. "We go careful. Watch each other. No heroics." The word hung heavy. They'd all seen enough of those end in graves. Hans lit a contraband cigarette, the smoke curling like a secret. "Heroics? In a garden. I'll stick to weeds. But if I find a rose bush, it's mine." Laughter bubbled up, thin but real, cutting the humid air. Outside, the cicadas droned on, oblivious to the fences. In the distance, a guard's lantern swayed, a firefly in the gathering dark. Karl lay back, the thin blanket scratching his skin. Tomorrow they'd dig. For what, he couldn't say. But in war, even dirt held promise, or peril. The sun hung low over the barbed wire, casting long shadows across the compound like fingers reaching for escape. Hans knelt in the dirt, his calloused hands turning the soil with a makeshift trowel fashioned from a tin can. Beside him, Karl muttered under his breath, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. The air smelled of earth and distant pine, a far cry from the acrid smoke of the front lines they'd left behind months ago. "This is madness," Karl said, his voice low but edged with that familiar sarcasm. "We're prisoners, not gardeners. What if the guards think we're digging a tunnel?" Hans glanced up, his blue eyes steady despite the lines etched around them from too many sleepless nights. At 32, he was the oldest in their small barrack group, the one who kept his head down and his thoughts to himself. Cautious, always calculating the next move. "Better they think we're harmless than plotting," he replied, pressing a seed into the furrow. It was a wildflower seed, smuggled in a letter from home, a fragile promise of color in this gray world. The Americans had surprised them all last week, handing out packets of seeds and tools with a casual wave, as if planting flowers could mend the fractures of war. No one had believed it at first. The guards just shrugged and said it kept idle hands. Busy. From the fence line, Corporal Ellis watched them, his rifle slung loosely over his shoulder. He was young, barely out of his teens, with a face still soft around the edges but eyes hardened by patrols. Ellis didn't speak much German, but he'd picked up enough to know when the POWs were grumbling. Today, though, he leaned against a post, chewing on a piece of gum, his gaze drifting to the neat rows taking shape. "You boys got a green thumb or what?" he called out in his drawl, the words mangled but clear enough. Hans straightened, nodding politely, while Karl shot him a look that said volumes. Trust nothing from the enemy. As the afternoon wore on, the compound buzzed with activity. Other prisoners shuffled by, some joining the planting, others hauling water from the communal pump. Fritz, the wiry one with the quick laugh and quicker fists, sauntered over, carrying a bucket sloshing with rainwater. He was the brave sort, the one who'd charged machine guns without flinching back in Normandy, but here he played the fool to survive. "Look at this," he said, dumping the water too forcefully and soaking Hans's brow. "Now your flowers will drown before they bloom, like us in that last push. Too much rain, not enough fight." Hans brushed the mud from his knees, forcing a half-smile. Fritz meant well, but his jokes always carried a barb, a reminder of the battles they'd lost. The four of them, Hans, Karl, Fritz, and quiet Otto, who lingered at the edge now, sketching the layout in the dirt with a stick, had formed a tight knot since capture. Otto was the artist, thoughtful and withdrawn, his fingers stained with charcoal from drawing camp life in secret. He didn't say much, but his eyes missed nothing. "The soil here's too sandy," Otto murmured, crouching to test it. "Won't hold water. We need compost or it'll all wash away in the next storm." Karl snorted, leaning on his shovel. "Compost? From what? Our rations? Those powdered eggs taste like they already are." Laughter rippled briefly, cut short by the distant clang of the mess hall bell. Supper would be the usual. Stew that stretched further than it filled, bread that crumbled like defeat. But today, tensions simmered beneath the routine. Whispers had spread through the barracks. Supplies were running low. The truck from the supply depot hadn't arrived in 2 days, and the guards were edgy, their jokes fewer, their grips tighter on their weapons. Ellis pushed off the fence, strolling closer. "Hey, Fritz," he said, mangling the name to Fritzy, as always. "You plantin' roses for the Fräuleins back home?" Fritz grinned, wiping his hands on his uniform pants. "Yeah, for the ones who'll wait. You got a girl, Corporal, or just the stars and stripes?" Ellis chuckled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Keep digging, boys. Colonel says it'll make the place look nicer for inspections." He turned away, but not before Hans caught the flicker of unease in his posture, the way his shoulders tensed at the mention of the Colonel. By dusk, the rows were half finished, a patchwork of hope against the dust. Hans stood back, surveying their work, the single vivid image of a lone daisy from last year's planting now wilted at the edge. It had been the first to sprout, defying the odds, but the frost had claimed it. Like so many things. Karl clapped him on the back. "If this is freedom, it's a strange kind." Otto nodded silently, erasing his dirt map with his boot, while Fritz hummed an old marching tune, off-key but defiant. That night, as the lights-out horn blared, the wind picked up, rattling the barracks like distant artillery. Hans lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling cracks that mapped out escape routes in his mind. The seeds were in the ground now, vulnerable. And with the supply truck delayed, rumors swirled of ration cuts, real hunger setting in, the kind that turned men against each other. Tomorrow the planting would continue, but the air felt heavier, charged with the unspoken fear that their small patch of earth might be the only ground left to hold. The sun hung low over the camp's barbed wire, casting long shadows across the rows of neat vegetable patches. Hans knelt in the dirt, his fingers tracing the edge of a newly turned furrow, the soil still cool and damp from the morning's rain. Beside him, Karl muttered under his breath, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. The American guards patrolled at a lazy distance, rifles slung over shoulders, their chatter in English, a distant hum like bees in a hive. "Flowers," Karl said, shaking his head as he drove the spade deeper. "They give us shovels for turnips and beans, and now this, as if we're guests at some English garden party." His voice carried the old bitterness, the kind that had hardened in the trenches back home, but there was a flicker of something else now. Curiosity, maybe, or just the relief of holding something other than a rifle. Hans didn't look up. He pressed a seed into the earth, covering it with a gentle pat. "Better than nothing. Remember the mud in France? This is clean. It's ours." The word hung there, simple and defiant. He'd been the quiet one in their unit, the mechanic who fixed engines under fire without a word, but out here, in the flat Kansas fields turned prison yard, words came easier when no one was shooting. From the edge of the plot, Fritz called out, leaning on his hoe like a crutch. He was the Joker, always had been, with a grin that could cut through the gloom of a bombed-out village. "Ours? Ha! The Yanks own the dirt, the water, the sky. But look at this." He held up a packet of seeds, the paper faded but intact, labeled in looping English script, "Marigolds." "They hand us these like candy. What next, chocolate and girls?" The three of them had been captured together at the Bulge, a ragged trio from the same Panzer division shipped across the ocean to this sprawling camp near Salina. At first, it had been lectures on American plenty, the guards boasting about their factories and freedoms while doling out spam and cigarettes. But then came the gardens. Not just for food, though the potatoes and corn kept dysentery at bay, but for beauty. The camp commandant, a stern colonel with a mustache like a broom, had announced it one morning, "Plant what you want, make it look like home." The POWs had stared, disbelieving as trucks unloaded tools and seed catalogs. Hans straightened, brushing soil from his knees. The air smelled of turned earth and distant rain, a far cry from the cordite and rot of the front. But freedom was a joke here. The wire reminded them daily. Still, as he surveyed the plot, the neat lines of onions they'd started weeks ago, now flanked by these frivolous blooms, he felt a pull, like the first crank of an engine catching. "Home," he echoed softly. "What does that even mean now?" Karl snorted, but his spade slowed. "Means surviving. The war's not over. Our boys are still fighting, and here we are, playing farmer. He glanced toward the guards, one of whom paused to light a smoke, watching them with idle interest. No malice in it, just routine. That was the strangest part. These Americans treated them like men, not animals. Meals on time, mail when it came, even books from the camp library. Karl had cracked one open last night, a dog-eared novel about cowboys, and read aloud in halting English until Fritz laughed himself hoarse. A shout from the barracks line broke the moment. Another work detail forming up for the quartermaster's warehouse, sorting crates under the watchful eye of Sergeant Ellis, the guard with the easy laugh and the habit of sharing gum. Hans felt a twinge. He'd volunteered for the gardens to avoid the heavier labor, the back-breaking shifts in the machine shops. But today, the air felt charged, like before a storm. Rumors had swirled at breakfast, something about a new batch of prisoners arriving from Europe, fresh off the boats, still wild with stories of the homeland. Fritz tossed the seed packet to Hans. "Plant them then. If the Yanks want flowers, let's give them a forest." His eyes sparkled with that old mischief, the kind that had gotten them through foxholes with stolen wine and tall tales. But as Hans caught the packet, a shadow crossed his face. The seeds were a gift, yes, but gifts in captivity always came with strings. What if this was just another way to break them, to make them forget the fight? They worked in silence for a stretch, the only sounds the scrape of tools and the occasional call of a meadowlark overhead. Karl broke it first, his voice low. "Heard from Dieter last night? The one in the East Compound?" Dieter was their fourth, separated on arrival, a wiry signals man with a knack for languages. He'd slipped a note through the fence 2 days back, scribbled on toilet paper, Red Cross parcels delayed, morale low, watch for spies among us. Hans nodded, not pausing as he spaced the seeds. Think some of the new ones might be plants. Gestapo holdouts, stirring trouble. The words tasted bitter, like the weak camp coffee. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford, not even among their own. The Americans preached unity, but the POWs knew better. Factions simmered, old rivalries from the Wehrmacht days flaring in whispers after lights out. Fritz straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. Spies. Here, with flowers? He laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. The tension coiled tighter, invisible but present, like the wire glinting in the sun. As the sun dipped lower, painting the plots in gold, Hans covered the last seed. The garden was taking shape, a small rebellion against the barrenness, but the real challenge loomed larger, holding on to who they were amid the kindness that felt like a trap. That evening, as the bugle sounded for chow, a truck rumbled into the compound, dust swirling in its wake. The new arrivals, gaunt faces peering from the back, stepped down under guard, their eyes scanning the fences, the gardens, the ordinary rhythm of camp life. One of them, a tall lieutenant with a scarred cheek, locked gazes with Hans across the yard. Recognition or warning? Hans turned away, the weight of the day settling like soil on his shoulders. The flowers would bloom soon enough, but trust, that was the harder seed to plant. The sun hung low over the barbed wire, casting long shadows across the compound, like fingers reaching for the horizon. Hans knelt in the dirt, his hands caked with soil, pressing a cluster of marigold seeds into the shallow furrow he'd scratched out with a bent spoon. The air smelled of turned earth and distant pine, a far cry from the acrid smoke of the front lines. Beside him, Klaus wiped sweat from his brow, his uniform sleeves rolled up to reveal faded tattoos from his Berlin days, anchors and eagles now dulled by months of captivity. "You think they'll let us water these?" Klaus muttered, glancing toward the guard tower where Private Ellis leaned on his rifle, chewing on a toothpick. The American's eyes flicked over them occasionally, but there was no bark in it. In his posture, no sudden commands. It unnerved Klaus more than the patrols ever had. Hans shrugged, patting the soil flat. Why not? They've given us the seeds. Lieutenant Harper said it was to make the place look less like a prison. He paused, his voice dropping. Though God knows what they really want. Morale? Or just to keep our hands busy so we don't plot escapes? Klaus snorted, but there was no humor in it. He'd been the one pushing for the garden from the start, back when the camp commandant announced the program. Plant something beautiful, the man had said in that clipped English, as if it were a gift. Now, 3 months in, rows of tulips and daisies bloomed along the fences, a ridiculous splash of color against the khaki drabness. But beauty didn't fill bellies, and whispers among the barracks grew thicker each night. Rumors of a supply truck delayed by weather, rations thinning again. From the far end of the plot, Dieter called out, his voice carrying over the rustle of leaves. Hans, over here. The fence post is loose again. If we nudge it. He trailed off, his eyes darting to the guards. Dieter was the cautious one, always calculating angles, but even he had softened toward the idea of the garden. It was his hands that had first coaxed life from the sterile ground, turning gravel into something green. Hans stood, brushing dirt from his knees, and walked over. The post wobbled under his grip, the wire sagging just enough to glimpse the tree line beyond. A dense wall of firs that hid the road to freedom, or so the stories went. But the patrols were relentless, and the last man who'd tried, young Fritz from Barracks C, had come back with a bullet graze and a week's solitary. No one spoke of it much after. Leave it, Hans said quietly, tightening the wire with his fingers. We're not runners. Not yet. He thought of his brother, left behind in the Ruhr, and the letters that never came. The garden was a distraction, yes, but it tethered him, made the days bearable. Dieter nodded, but his jaw tightened. The truck's late. If the food doesn't come tomorrow, they'll have a riot on their hands. These flowers won't stop that. As if on cue, a horn blared from the main gate. Short, insistent. The POWs straightened, tools dropping into the dirt. Private Ellis straightened too, his toothpick falling to the ground. Heads up, he called in his drawl, but there was no urgency, just routine. The truck rolled in, not the expected supply hauler, but a battered jeep, mud-splattered from the mountain roads. Lieutenant Harper climbed out, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He was a tall man, mid-30s, with a face weathered by Normandy and eyes that missed nothing. Flanking him were 2 MPs, rifles slung low, and between them, stumbling slightly, was a figure in tattered Wehrmacht gray. Another prisoner, fresh from the lines, his face gaunt under a weak stubble. New blood, Klaus whispered, edging closer. The man looked half dead, eyes hollow as he scanned the compound. When his gaze landed on the garden, he froze, mouth parting in confusion. Harper barked an order, and the MPs shoved the newcomer forward. Barracks B, the lieutenant said. Get him cleaned up. But the man didn't move at first, staring at the blooms as if they were illusions. A daisy nodded in the breeze, petals bright against the wire. Flowers, the newcomer rasped, his accent thick with Bavarian hills. In a camp, the Americans. They let you. Hans stepped forward before he could stop himself. Yeah, they do. He met the man's eyes, seeing the shock mirror his own from months ago. Name's Hans. Come, we'll show you. The lieutenant watched the exchange, his expression unreadable. He'd been the one to approve the garden, citing some War Department memo on rehabilitation. But Hans had seen the flicker in his eyes during inspections, the moral weight of it all, holding men who might have been friends in another life. As the newcomer shuffled toward the barracks, Klaus leaned in. Think he'll spill about the front? The Allies pushing harder? Dieter shook his head. Doesn't matter. If that truck doesn't show, we'll all be pushing our own luck. That night, the wind picked up, rattling the barracks like distant artillery. Hans lay on his bunk, the scent of damp soil clinging to his skin. The new man, Karl, bunked across from him, staring at the ceiling. "I thought it'd be worse," Karl said finally, voice low. "Chains, beatings, but flowers. It's madness." Hans turned his head. "Madness keeps you sane. Plant with us tomorrow. Might steady your hands." Karl's laugh was bitter, short. "Steady for what? The war's ending, they say, but for us, who knows?" Outside, rain began to patter, soaking the fresh earth. By morning, the furrows would be mud, the seeds at risk. Hans closed his eyes, the weight of it settling. Another day of tending illusions, while the real storm brewed beyond the wire. In the guard shack, Lieutenant Harper pored over a map under lantern light, the supply delay circled in red. Ellis hovered nearby, nursing a cigarette. "Those krauts are getting restless, sir. The garden's nice, but hunger talks louder." Harper folded the map, his fingers lingering on the lines tracing the camp's perimeter. "Keep eyes on them. No incidents." But as he stepped out into the rain, he glanced at the darkened plots, wondering if beauty could hold back the tide any longer. The next dawn broke gray. The sun hung low over the barbed wire, casting long shadows across the camp's vegetable plots. Hans knelt in the dirt, his fingers tracing the wilted edges of the tomato plants. The heat wave had come on, sudden, like a fever, turning the soil to dust and the leaves to brittle paper. For days now, the prisoners had hauled water from the central pump, rationing it between their bunks and the gardens they'd coaxed from nothing. But it wasn't enough. The flowers, those defiant bursts of color amid the rows of potatoes and beans, were the first to suffer, their petals curling inward as if ashamed. Karl wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, his uniform sleeve stiff with salt. He stood a few paces away, leaning on the wooden crate they'd fashioned into a makeshift trellis. "We should pull them up," he said, voice low, not wanting the guards to overhear. "Save the water for what feeds us." Hans didn't look up. He pressed a thumb into the parched earth, feeling the cracks give way like old leather. "And what then? We eat, but we forget why we're here." His words carried the weight of their shared silences, the nights when they'd spoken of home in whispers, fields blooming under Bavarian skies, not this endless flatness. From the far end of the plot, Fritz called out, his voice sharp with the edge of frustration. He was the youngest, barely 20, with a wiry build that made him look even smaller under the relentless sun. "Forget? How can we forget when the tomatoes are dying too?" He dropped his hoe into the dirt and stalked over, kicking up a small cloud of dust. The three of them had become the unofficial keepers of this patch, a corner of the camp the Americans had surprisingly left to them after that first awkward request months ago. No one had expected permission, least of all for flowers. Marigolds and zinnias, seeds smuggled in a guard's forgotten lunch pail, a small rebellion, or maybe just a way to remember green. The guard on duty that afternoon, Sergeant Ellis, ambled by the fence, his rifle slung casual over one shoulder. He was one of the fairer ones, a farm boy from Iowa who'd taken to chatting about crop rotations during his rounds. Today, though, his face was tight, eyes scanning the wilting rows. "You boys holding up?" he asked, stopping at the wire. Hans straightened, brushing soil from his knees. He nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "The heat, Sergeant. It's taking its toll." Ellis glanced at the flowers, the ones Karl had suggested uprooting. A few still held their heads high, yellow petals catching the light like tiny suns. "Heard there's a storm coming in from the west. Might break this dry spell." He paused, then added, almost to himself, "My pa's fields looked like this back in '42, lost half the corn before the rains hit." Fritz snorted but softly, turning away to hide it. Karl shot him a warning look. Gratitude wasn't their way, not after Stalingrad, not after the marches. But Hans met the sergeant's eyes. "We'll manage. Danke. Thank you for the heads up." Ellis tipped his helmet and moved on, his boots crunching gravel. The three men watched him go, the silence between them thickening like the air before thunder. That night, as the camp settled into its uneasy rhythm, coughs echoing from the barracks, the distant hum of generators, Hans couldn't sleep. The heat lingered, pressing down on the thin blankets. He slipped from his bunk and made his way to the latrine, but detoured toward the garden instead. Moonlight silvered the wire, turning the plots into a ghostly patchwork. The flowers seemed frailer in the dark, their colors leached away. Karl was already there, sitting on the crate with a canteen in hand. He didn't startle when Hans approached. Couldn't sleep either. Hans shook his head, settling beside him. The ground was still warm, radiating the day's fire. Fritz was right, the tomatoes are suffering. But these, he gestured to the marigolds, their leaves drooping like weary soldiers. They remind me of Mutti's window boxes. She planted them every spring, said they kept the bugs away and the evil eye too. Karl took a swig from the canteen, passing it over. The water was tepid, tasting of tin. Superstition, but I get it. Out here, with nothing but mud and memories. It's something. He leaned back, staring at the stars pricking through the haze. Back in the lines, we didn't have time for this. Dig a trench, hold it, move. Now we plant, and it dies anyway. A rustle from the shadows made them both tense. Fritz emerged, his face pale in the moonlight, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Heard you talking," he muttered, dropping down to join them. "Couldn't sleep with the heat. Thought maybe we could try something." He unwrapped the bundle, a handful of potato peels, scraps of onion from the kitchen slop, and a few wilted greens they'd salvaged earlier. "Compost," he said, almost defiant. "The Americans talked about it once in that pamphlet. Mix it in, keep the soil alive." Hans examined the pile, the meager offering. It was a gamble, burying what little organic matter they had, hoping it would draw moisture or nutrients without wasting more water. Karl frowned. "And if it doesn't work, we lose the peels too." Fritz's jaw set. "We lose everything if we do nothing. The storm Ellis mentioned, it might not come, or it might flood us out." His voice cracked on the last word, betraying the boy beneath the uniform. They worked in silence then, digging shallow trenches around the flower beds, mixing in the scraps with the dry earth. Hans's hands ached from the labor, blisters reopening under the strain. Sweat trickled into his eyes, but he didn't stop. Karl joined in, his movements precise like loading a rifle. Fritz shoveled with a fervor that bordered on anger, as if the dirt owed him something. By the time they finished, the eastern sky was lightening, a faint gray promise. They covered their tracks, scattering dirt to hide the fresh turns. As they headed back, Fritz paused at the fence, gazing out at the empty fields beyond. "Why do they let us do this?" he whispered. "Plant flowers like we're not... you know." Hans clapped a hand on his... The sun hung low over the barbed wire, casting long shadows across the compound like fingers reaching for the flower beds. Klaus knelt in the dirt, his hands caked with soil, carefully pressing a salvaged tomato seedling into the earth. The air smelled of damp earth and distant rain, a far cry from the acrid smoke of the front lines. Beside him, Heinrich wiped sweat from his brow, his wiry frame tense as he scanned the horizon. "They're watching us again," he muttered, nodding toward the guard tower where Sergeant Ellis leaned on the railing, binoculars in hand. Klaus didn't look up. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the ache in his joints, a remnant of the march that had brought them here months ago. "Let them watch. It's their dirt we're turning." He'd always been the steady one, the farmer's son who believed in coaxing life from stubborn ground. Back in Bavaria, his fields had bloomed under his care. Here, in this American prison camp in the Oklahoma dust, the flowers were his quiet rebellion. Not against the guards, but against the emptiness that gnawed at a man when all he had was barbed wire and regret. Heinrich snorted, but there was no humor in it. He was the cautious one, always calculating risks, his eyes sharp from years dodging patrols in the Ardennes. Rebellion? It's a flower, Klaus, not a grenade. He straightened, brushing soil from his knees, and glanced at the other plots dotting the yard. Vibrant patches of marigolds and zinnias that the POWs had coaxed from smuggled seeds and camp scraps. The Americans had allowed it, almost indifferently, after a petition circulated among the prisoners. No one understood why. Freedom in chains, Heinrich called it. From the mess hall, shouts erupted. Private Ramirez, the young guard assigned to their barracks, jogged over, his boots kicking up red dust. He was barely 20, with a face still soft around the edges, but his rifle hung heavy on his shoulder. "You two, on your feet." Commandant's calling a meeting. "Something about the weather." His voice carried that Midwestern drawl, clipped now with urgency. Klaus rose slowly, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Weather? It's been dry as bone for weeks." The camp sat on the edge of the plains, where thunderstorms could roll in like artillery barrages, but today the sky was a relentless blue. Ramirez shrugged, avoiding their eyes. "Not dry anymore. Scouts say a front's coming, big one, could flood the river, wash out the fences." He hesitated, then added, almost under his breath, "Your gardens. They might not make it." Heinrich's jaw tightened. The gardens weren't just plants. They were the one thing that felt like home, a fragile tether to the lives they'd left behind. Letters from families spoke of ruined fields in Germany, bombed-out villages where nothing grew. Here, at least, they could nurture something. And what? We just watch it drown? The private shifted uncomfortably. Commandant's got ideas. "But hurry, Ellis is pacing like a cat." They followed Ramirez across the yard, past clusters of POWs who murmured in low German, their faces etched with the same quiet defiance. The compound buzzed with unease. Word of the storm had spread like shrapnel. In the administration hut, a cluster of officers stood around a map pinned to the wall, red lines marking the swollen Arkansas River nearby. Commandant Hargrove, a stern man with a mustache like a broom bristle, looked up as they entered. Sergeant Ellis flanked him, arms crossed, his gaze lingering on Klaus and Heinrich as if they were the storm itself. "You're the ones with the green thumbs," Hargrove said, not unkindly. His voice was gravelly, worn from years of command. "River's rising faster than predicted. Levees might hold the main camp, but your little paradise out there, it'll be underwater by dawn if we don't act." Klaus met his eyes steadily. "We've reinforced the beds with what we have. Sacks and stones. But more. Sandbags could help." Ellis barked a laugh. "Sandbags? For flowers? This ain't a spa, Fritz." He was the tough one among the guards, a farm boy from Iowa who'd seen too much in Normandy to trust easily. Yet even he had tossed them a few empty crates last week, grumbling about wasted effort. Hargrove held up a hand. "Stow it, Sergeant. These men have skills we need." He turned to the map, tracing the river's bend. "Flood could breach the east fence. If it does, we're all in the soup, escapes, chaos, you name it. I need you two to organize the others, dig trenches to divert the water, shore up the low spots. In return, we'll get you extra supplies. No tricks." Heinrich exchanged a glance with Klaus. It was a gamble. Labor under guard, exposed to the elements. But refusing meant watching their work vanish. And beneath the practicality, a deeper current stirred. Trust, fragile as the seedlings, extended from captor to captive. "We'll do it," Klaus said finally. "But we led the work, our way." The commandant nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Agreed. Ramirez, you're with them. Keep it tight." Outside, the first clouds gathered, dark and swollen as the POWs assembled. Klaus directed them with quiet authority, assigning tasks, some to haul sand from the dry creek bed, others to weave barriers from scrap wire and canvas. Heinrich worked beside him, his earlier caution giving way to focused energy. "This storm," he said, heaving a sack into place, "it's like the Blitz all over again. You wait for the hit, and it never comes the same way twice." Klaus paused, the weight of the bag grounding him. "Then we build stronger, not for the war, for us." Rain began to patter, light at first, then insistent, turning the earth to mud. Ramirez hovered nearby, rifle slung low, but his shouts to hurry held less edge now, more like a teammate's urging. As dusk fell, the wind howled, whipping tents and bending the young flowers. Water seeped through the fences, a creeping tide that tested every barrier. Heinrich slipped in the slick mud, cursing as he caught himself on a post. Klaus pulled him up, their hands clasping briefly, brothers in this unintended alliance. From the tower, Ellis's silhouette watched, unmoving. By midnight, the river roared like distant guns, and the sun hung low over the camp's perimeter, casting long shadows across the garden plots that had once been barren dirt. Heinrich knelt by his row of marigolds, the soil still damp from the morning's watering. His hands, calloused from years of wielding a rifle, now cradled a trowel with unexpected gentleness. The flowers had bloomed defiantly, their orange petals a stark contrast to the gray uniformity of the barbed wire fences. He wiped sweat from his brow, glancing at the guard tower where Private Ellis leaned against the railing, rifle slung casually over his shoulder. "Look at that," muttered Karl from the adjacent plot, his voice low but carrying the weight of disbelief. Karl had been the skeptic from the start, the one who'd scoffed when the Americans first suggested the gardening detail. Now he pruned a bush of lavender with careful snips, inhaling its faint, soothing scent. "We came here expecting chains and labor camps. Instead, they hand us seeds and say, 'Make it pretty.' Madness." Heinrich chuckled softly, though his eyes remained watchful. The war's end had come months ago, but the peace felt fragile, like the thin stems bending in the breeze. Whispers among the prisoners spoke of repatriation, trains waiting beyond the horizon to carry them home to a Germany in ruins. Yet the garden rooted them here, a small act of creation amid the destruction they'd left behind. "It's not madness," Heinrich replied, pressing a fresh layer of mulch around his plants. "It's trust or pity. Either way, it's more than we deserved after Stalingrad." From the mess hall, shouts echoed, Lucas organizing a final game of soccer before lights out. The wiry medic, always the one to rally spirits, had taken to the garden with fervor, his plot a riot of sunflowers that towered over the others. But today, his laughter rang hollow. Heinrich knew why. The latest mail call had brought news. Lucas's brother, lost in the east, confirmed dead. No speeches, no consolations. Just the quiet acceptance that came with tending to what could still grow. Private Ellis sauntered over, his boots crunching on the gravel path. He was young, barely out of his teens, with a face unscarred by the front lines he'd never seen. "You're making progress," he drawled, nodding at the blooms. "Camp commander's talking about a flower show next week. Winners get extra rations." Karl straightened, brushing dirt from his knees. A flower show in a prison. His tone held no bitterness, only that familiar incredulity. Over the months, the garden had woven unlikely threads between them and the guards. Stories exchanged over fences, cigarettes shared during evening patrols. Ellis had even admitted once, in a rare moment of candor, that he'd enlisted to escape a Dust Bowl farm, only to find himself herding men who'd marched across Europe. Heinrich stood, his back aching from the labor that was no labor at all. "We'll enter," he said simply. "What else is there?" The words hung between them, a quiet defiance. Beyond the garden, trucks rumbled in the distance, loading supplies for the journey east. Repatriation orders had trickled in. Soon the plots would be empty, the flowers left to seed themselves or wither. As dusk settled, the three gathered by the sunflowers, Lucas joining them with a handful of weeds he'd pulled. No one spoke of the letters or the losses. Instead, Karl recounted a memory from their Bavarian village, how his mother had planted roses along the garden wall, a barrier against the world. They bloomed through the bombings, he said, his voice steady. Stubborn things. Ellis lingered at the edge, listening without interrupting. When the bugles sounded for lockdown, he tipped his helmet. "Night, fellas. Keep those flowers coming." In their barracks that evening, the air hummed with subdued talk. Heinrich lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling where the faint sketches of petals had been penciled by a previous occupant. The garden had changed them, not erased the mud of the trenches or the screams of the wounded, but softened the edges. They'd planted not just flowers, but a fragile hope that humanity could sprout even in confinement. The next morning brought the trucks earlier than expected. Guards herded the prisoners into lines, duffels slung over shoulders. Heinrich paused at his plot one last time, pressing a marigold seed into the earth, a parting gift. Karl clapped his shoulder. Lucas nodded grimly. As they boarded, the garden receded, a patchwork of color against the khaki landscape. Weeks later, in a displaced persons camp on the Rhine, Heinrich received a package, a photograph from Ellis, clipped from a newspaper. It showed the camp's flower show, their entries proudly displayed, ribbons pinned to the wires. Scribbled on the back. They couldn't believe it either. But you made it real. Heinrich folded the photo away, the weight of it lighter than the rifle he'd once carried. The war had taken much. But in that small plot of American soil, something had been returned.